A street opens up to a view. A skyline is framed without you noticing why. In one of the densest cities in the world, invisible lines guide where roads turn, what stays in view, and how the city grows around them. So, who draws these lines? And how do they continue to shape Singapore? In the heart of Singapore's central business district, an old temple still stands. Why here, and why facing this direction? Long before the city took its present shape, this was Singapore's shoreline.
We are now located in what we call historically the Telok Ayer Basin. The temple is orientated towards the sea.
Kang Shua is an architectural historian. He looks at how historic buildings shape the city around them, including this temple.
In the mid to late 19th century, you start to see three very prominent religious organizations or buildings along this stretch of road. So imagine if you're a migrant coming on a boat, coming into Singapore, and that will give you a visual cue to identify that this is a place of worship and it's my first stop upon embarking onto the land in Singapore to give thanks for my safe voyage.
Today, there's nothing to show where the shoreline once ran. We know it from old maps and from records left behind. But stand here, and the temple still faces that same direction. The city grew, the temple stayed.
Historic landmarks give meaning to a place. For those who understand the history of the temple, this is a tangible reminder where our coastline used to be. To a certain extent, conserving or preserving the tangible is relatively easy. What is actually difficult is the intangible. You need space for that. And once that space is preserved and sort of ring-fenced for certain events, the intangible will habit. The people will again get to know and come and congregate.
Step outside the temple today and you face a modern building. The shoreline is gone, but the way this space relates to the sea hasn't disappeared.
In front of the temple today is the Telok Ayer Road, and beyond the road is a little forecourt, and that modern-day building is owned by the same organization that owns the temple. It sort of harks back to the open square and the kind of opera stage where the open square in front of the temple creates opportunity for the temple to use during festivities. And of course, on the ground level, you see a little opening through the building. It sort of respects a certain kind of imaginary axis towards the sea.
A visual corridor through the building. It still shapes how people move through this space today. Elsewhere in the city, the land itself shaped how the early town grew, starting from a hill that once looked out over everything.
So this view corridor here really honors the different layers of our city. From this vantage point, if you look down at High Street, extending from the foot of Fort Canning all the way down to the Singapore River, is really the coming together of two worlds that was so important to us in the past.
Yong studies how history still shapes how we move and see the city. From Fort Canning, a clear line runs down to High Street, one of Singapore's earliest civic alignments. It connects the hill above to the riverfront, where trade and settlement once took place.
What a lot of Singaporeans may not know is that High Street was actually the very first street that was built in Singapore in the 1800s, shortly after Raffles came. And you may ask, why so? That's because Raffles built his home on Fort Canning Hill. And from that vantage point at his home, you can actually look out down High Street to the Malay village and to the Singapore River where the harbour was established. And at this Malay village lived a very important person, the Temenggung. And he would have been the one discussing with Raffles to sign the initial treaty in 1819.
That link still exists, pointing back to a turning point in Singapore's early colonial history.
Because of this view corridor, we are able to make that linkage and then tell that story of what took place in the 1800s.
View corridors is one of the really key urban design strategies that we have to ensure that places remain relatable to us.
Lei Hua oversees how the city centre is planned and shaped, including how long-standing connections are protected as the city grows.
The buildings around Fort Canning are generally kept quite low-rise. And this is important so that we always remember that there's this Fort Canning Hill, very historical within the city centre. So as we guide the developments, we make sure that this view from Fort Canning down to the Marina Bay is still preserved. So for example, in a high street, you would be able to look up to the summit, see almost Raffles House at the summit. At the same time, you can also look down and see Marina Bay without being blocked by very tall buildings in front of you.
By managing building heights, planners keep long-established sightlines intact, linking landmarks across the city's centre even as the skyline changes.
View corridors ensure that we can locate ourselves in a place. We can recognize familiar views, landmarks, and skylines to have a sense of place so that we can relate to where we are at that moment.
The same thinking appears elsewhere in the city.
So at One Fullerton, you will notice that in the middle of the building, there is almost a gaping hole with the steps going down to the waterfront. And what that view corridor does is to preserve the connection between the waterfront and the historic civic core.
Sometimes the city is shaped as much by what's left open as what's built.
So for natural assets like Marina Bay, for example, we want to make sure that the Marina Bay itself is a predominant feature. Okay, then all the way the view goes up to the bay. We specified a 15-meter wide, 2-story high view corridor aligned along Anderson Bridge. So if you're coming from the Civic District, you will actually be able to look directly and see the bay. And you realize, oh, I'm just next to, Marina Bay. On the opposite side, Marina Bay Sands, you can look through the shopping podium and see the bay and the Civic District in the background. The natural features and the geography of an area is really the starting point of our urban design. What we try to do is to emphasize on these features and then either turn them into focal points or at least always make sure that the buildings that are designed relate to all these key natural features like hills and then water bodies.
View corridors can also tie landmarks together.
As we were planning for the Singapore Management University, because it was located between the National Museum and also the former St. Joseph's Institution, we wanted to make sure that the visual link between these two national monuments are still kept. Because for those of us who were here long enough, we always remembered Bras Basah was the place that people kicked football, and the old buildings around there were very familiar to us. So we don't want to lose sight of that even as we, progress and have more buildings come up around these very, very significant areas, places that we have memories of.
It's a continuation of a story of the district. With this view corridor, we are reminded of the past that brings back the stories of Bras Basah as the academic heart of Singapore back then, and many more schools that were in that area. And we see ourselves as part of that story that's being written for Singapore.
Nowhere is this sense of continuity clearer than the river. It was Singapore's first connector, shaping trade, movement, and the early city.
So if you come down to Singapore River today at Boat Quay, you'll notice it's gently curving, and that curve actually forms what is known as the belly of the carp. And that is very favorable to a lot of Chinese businessmen because it is very auspicious. And that is exactly retained in what you see today. So if you walk along Singapore River, this exact pathway was also where the early immigrants, the coolies, would have walked on. It's amazing to see how these roads still kind of serve the same function, that is mobility.
Along the quays, familiar forms still anchor the river's edge.
If you start from bottom up, there's a river, right? So there's this unifying element of a 50-meter wide promenade on both sides, flanked by trees. And then after that, we have the 4-story building each, human scale so that you don't get overwhelmed by building next to you. And then after that, with the 10-story behind. So there's this stepping back of buildings focusing on the river. And then to top it off, there's also the roof. So that at all angles, whether at the human level, you can actually trace the whole river just by looking at the terracotta roofs. So it's not just the roof that unifies, it's really all the different layers of urban design that we've guided that really makes the whole precinct identity so imageable.
And the river still does what it always has, linking people, places, and purpose.
We want to make sure that the buildings don't overshadow all these natural features that we already have in the city. Whether it's old or new, there is still a certain language and a certain memory of what this place was and where we are today.
Singapore doesn't grow by erasing what came before. Earlier decisions still shape how the city is seen and used, even as it changes. Across temples, hills, streets, and rivers, these invisible lines remain in place, guiding how the city holds its past while making room for what comes next.